Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today, we dive into the fascinating story of one of America's most legendary families, the Vanderbilts. From unimaginable wealth and dazzling mansions to the dramatic decline that followed, we'll explore how this iconic dynasty rose to the top of society and, over time, lost the fortune that once seemed untouchable. Join us as we uncover the triumphs, the extravagance, and the lessons behind the story of America's Gilded Age aristocracy. In the vast and intricate story of American history, few names carry the strange mixture of awe, grandeur, tragedy, and mystery as the name Vanderbilt. It is a name that once commanded respect, envy, admiration, and even fear. A name that symbolized the heights of ambition and the limitless world of American opportunity. A name synonymous with unprecedented wealth so large, so staggering, that even describing it in modern terms feels almost unreal. And yet, it is also a name that would eventually become an echo, fading into the background of time, swallowed by new eras, new fortunes, and new power. Today, the Vanderbilt name is known not for present riches, but for the extraordinary legacy of riches that were gained, expanded, flaunted, celebrated, mismanaged, and finally lost. The story of America is, in many ways, a story of rise and fall, new beginnings, bold dreams, fortunes built from sweat and risk, and fortunes lost through neglect or circumstance. But few families encapsulate this cycle as clearly or as dramatically as the Vanderbilts. Their journey from obscurity to unmatched power, and then from unmatched power to eventual financial decline, is not simply a tale of money. It is a reflection of human ambition itself, how one man's relentless drive can build an empire so massive that it becomes legendary, and how future generations, far removed from the founder's hardships and vision, can lose touch with the very discipline and struggle that created their fortune. In the first place, to understand the Vanderbilts, one must first step back into a very different America. Picture the early 1008. A young nation still growing, still searching for its identity and its future. Cities were small, industries were emerging, and the possibilities of the land seemed limitless. There were no giant corporations, no towering skyscrapers, no billion-dollar companies run by teams of executives. Power belonged to those who dared to work, to fight, to take risks, and to seize opportunities before anyone else could recognize them. It was an era where a sharp mind and an indomitable will could create something truly extraordinary. It was in this world that Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 into a simple Staten Island farming family. They had no wealth, no privileges, no social connections. What they did have, however, was the harshness of survival, long hours, demanding work, and the necessity of stretching every coin as far as it could go. Young Cornelius grew up in an environment where every small advantage mattered. He had only a basic education and spent much of his childhood doing physical labor. But beneath the surface of this rugged upbringing was something else, an instinct, a sharpness, a natural understanding of business that could not be taught in any school. Cornelius had the kind of mind that noticed the small inefficiencies in the world around him, the kind of problems that, if solved, could create opportunity. He realized early on that transportation, moving people and goods, was the lifeline of a growing nation. Boats, ferries, and trading routes were essential to growth. Anyone who controlled them controlled not just profits, but potential. At 16 years old, Cornelius borrowed money from his mother to purchase a small boat. A simple vessel, nothing that appeared impressive, nothing that would draw attention from anyone walking by, but in the hands of an ambitious young man with a vision, it would become the first stepping stone to a fortune that would one day rival the wealth of kings. Cornelius used that boat to ferry passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan. He worked long days, rough waters, unpredictable conditions, but he was consistent, reliable, and smarter than anyone realized. He understood competition, he understood pricing, and he understood how to gain customers. He cut costs and increased service in a way that quickly made him the preferred choice among commuters. In every era, there are a few individuals whose determination is so strong that obstacles simply do not stop them. They fuel them. Cornelius was one of these individuals. As his reputation grew, so did his small fleet. He reinvested almost everything he earned, not in luxuries, not in comforts, but in opportunity. He relentlessly studied the shipping routes, identified gaps competitors missed, and moved quickly to fill them. Before long, his operations expanded far beyond a simple ferry service. He became a formidable figure in the steamboat industry, refusing to be intimidated by the wealthy, established operators who felt threatened by a young man rising from nothing. Cornelius Vanderbilt was aggressive, uncompromising, and fiercely strategic. In business, he was a warrior, unwilling to bend and always aware of the direction markets were moving. His rivals underestimated him, believing that his humble background meant he lacked sophistication. They learned, painfully and quickly, that they were wrong. Cornelius fought with every tool available: lower prices, faster services, better boats, and, when needed, sheer persistence. Many rivals either collapsed or surrendered under the pressure. With each victory, the Vanderbilt empire grew larger and more powerful. By the time Cornelius reached middle age, he was no longer merely a ferry operator. He was a titan of transportation, a man whose influence reached far beyond New York. But what made him extraordinary was not just the empire he built, but his ability to predict the future. Even when steamboats were thriving, even when they dominated commerce, Cornelius noticed a new force emerging on the horizon: railroads. These early railroads were rough, unsafe, undeveloped, and far from glamorous. But Cornelius saw something that others did not. He saw the future. Railroads had the potential to shrink the nation, connect distant regions, move goods with unprecedented speed, and create wealth on a scale no industry had ever achieved. And so, in a move that seemed strange to many at the time, Cornelius shifted his focus away from the empire he had already built and toward the empire he was about to build. He began investing in railroads, acquiring lines, consolidating routes, and slowly shaping the Eastern rail system into a structured, efficient network. As always, he cut inefficiencies, removed corruption, and streamlined operations. He brought order to chaos. In doing so, he revolutionized transportation again. Since the early settlers first stepped off their ships, no man had changed the movement of people and goods across the country as profoundly as Cornelius Vanderbilt. Wealth followed him like a shadow. Every decision, every investment, every calculated risk seemed to multiply his fortune. By the time he grew old, he was no longer just wealthy. He was one of the richest men in the world, his fortune reaching a level that today would be valued in the hundreds of billions. Yet the magnitude of his wealth was only one part of his story. The other part was the example he set for what determination could accomplish. Cornelius Vanderbilt became the very embodiment of the American dream, a man rising from poverty to power, from obscurity to legacy. For the nation, he was a symbol of possibility. For his family, he was the foundation of an empire that seemed unshakable. But time has a way of revealing the truth about empires. They are strong when their vision is clear, when leadership is steady, when discipline is inherited. But over generations, visions blur, priorities shift, and the connection to struggle is often lost. Cornelius Vanderbilt built his empire with relentless effort, precision, and discipline, but those who inherited it did not experience the same hardship or hunger. And that difference, though subtle at first, would eventually become the fault line that cracked the foundation of the Vanderbilt fortune. The first generation of heirs lived in the world their father created, a world of stability, prosperity, and influence. But as the decades passed, the family expanded and grew more distant from the values that built their empire. Many descendants embraced lifestyles of extravagant luxury, grand mansions, lavish parties, ornate clothing, and expensive tastes rivaling European royalty. They stepped into a world of privilege, a world where wealth appeared infinite, where fortunes felt permanent, and where the concept of running out of money seemed impossible. But no fortune, no matter how vast, survives untouched if it is not protected, nurtured, and guided with the same discipline that created it. What makes the story of the Vanderbilts so fascinating is that it mirrors a universal truth: wealth is fragile. Without stewardship, without structure, without vision, even the grandest fortunes fade. The story of their rise is thrilling. The story of their fall is sobering. And the story of how both happened within just a few generations makes the Vanderbilt family one of the most compelling dynasties in American history. Cornelius Vanderbilt's life was a testament to what ambition can create. His descendants' lives became a testament to what a lack of shared vision can destroy. But before exploring the decline, one must first understand the full weight of what the Vanderbilts once achieved, the height of their power, the scale of their influence, and the magnitude of their fortune. Only then can the fall be truly understood. It is within this contrast, the rise from poverty to unimaginable wealth, followed by the dramatic collapse, that the true heart of the Vanderbilt story emerges. Theirs is not just a historical narrative, but a human one, a reflection of dreams, triumphs, mistakes, and the passage of time, a reminder that empires rise from effort and fall from neglect, and a symbol of how dramatically life can change within a single family line. The story begins with a young boy on Staten Island, armed only with determination and a single small boat. It ends with a fractured dynasty, their wealth dissolved, their power gone, their name remembered more for what they once were than what they became. Yet it is in the beginning, in the extraordinary rise, that the full meaning of the Vanderbilt legacy truly lives. Cornelius Vanderbilt's rise from poverty to immense power did not happen overnight, nor did it happen by accident. It was carved day by day, year by year, through a combination of instinct, intelligence, stubbornness, and an almost ferocious determination that separated him from the average ambitions of ordinary men. To understand the true force of his ascent, one must understand the era he lived in, an era of steam, growth, expansion, and explosive possibilities. America in the early 19th century was a nation pulsing with potential, ripe for those bold enough to seize it. The young nation was still finding its identity, still shaping its systems of commerce and industry. Roads were unreliable, travel was slow, and transportation of goods was inconsistent and often dangerous. Most people simply accepted these difficulties as facts of life, but Cornelius Vanderbilt did not accept limitations. He examined them, he studied them, he asked questions no one else bothered to ask. Why does travel take so long? Why does transporting goods cost so much? Why are prices inconsistent? Why are schedules unreliable? In every problem, he saw opportunity. Even as a boy, Cornelius possessed a mind that grasped the mechanics of business not through education, but through observation. He understood people and patterns, markets and motives. He understood supply and demand instinctively, long before he would ever hear those words. When he ferried passengers in his small boat, he didn't just move them across the water, he studied them. He listened to complaints about delays, prices, safety, and convenience. He watched which routes were popular, which were underused, and how weather or tides influenced demand. These observations were not accidental. He processed them, evaluated them, used them to refine his strategy. Every day on the water was a lesson in economics and human behavior. Unlike many entrepreneurs of his era, Cornelius had no benefactors, no social connections, and no elegant education to open doors for him. His only advantages were his work ethic and his extraordinary strategic thinking. He worked harder than those around him, not for the sake of work itself, but because he knew that endurance was a weapon, a tool, a way to outlast those who lacked his hunger. And while others complained about the overwhelming demands of the shipping business, Cornelius saw it as a battlefield he was destined to dominate. He didn't just want a piece of the industry, he wanted to own the industry. As his operations grew, the young Vanderbilt began to attract attention. Some admired him for his skill, others despised him for his competitiveness. Rivals in the ferry and steamboat industries noticed that he was not simply another operator, he was a disruptor. He was a threat to traditional business models and to the comfortable profits enjoyed by established companies. Many of these companies had become complacent, charging high prices because customers had few alternatives. Service was inconsistent because there was no competition forcing improvement. They did not anticipate that a young man with no formal training would challenge their dominance. Yet that is precisely what Cornelius did. He lowered prices dramatically, sometimes to the point where profits were minimal, but the losses were not permanent. They were strategic. Low prices attracted passengers in enormous numbers, weakening competitors, pushing them to the brink. Once rivals collapsed or sold their routes, Cornelius increased his prices slightly, stabilized his operations, and then moved his attention to another weak point in the market. It was a strategy so bold and so aggressive that established companies had no answer for it. They simply could not match his endurance, his speed, or his efficiency. Cornelius was faster because he was smarter. He understood that transportation was not just about boats. It was about systems. He optimized schedules, adjusted routes, hired better crews, and maintained his vessels with discipline and precision. To him, the business was not a competition of luck, but a science of motion and timing. And every year his empire grew. The steamboat era brought new challenges. Steamboats required mechanical knowledge, capital investment, and management of much larger operations. Many men entering the steamboat industry did so with confidence but too little understanding. They built glamorous vessels but ignored cost efficiency. They offered luxury but ignored reliability. They tried to dominate markets through appearances rather than strategy. But Cornelius Vanderbilt saw the steamboat not as a symbol of status, but as a tool of war in the economic battlefield. He built vessels that were fast, strong, and functional. He did not waste resources on unnecessary ornamentation. He invested where it mattered: speed, durability, and operational efficiency. When he entered the Hudson River steamboat market, competitors laughed. They called him unrefined, uncultured, unworthy of serious competition. But within months, their laughter stopped. Within a few years, many of these same competitors were bankrupt or had been absorbed into his expanding enterprise. His influence became so dominant that he drew the attention of government officials and wealthy financiers, many of whom feared his power. But Cornelius did not back down. He believed that business was survival, and survival required strength. It was during the steamboat years that Cornelius earned the nickname that would define him for the rest of his life: the Commodore, a title usually reserved for naval commanders. It symbolized respect, authority, control, and mastery of the waters. And Cornelius Vanderbilt embodied all of those qualities. He was a commander not of ships, but of commerce. Yet even as he conquered the waterways, he never allowed himself to become complacent. He understood something that many businessmen fail to grasp. Markets change, industries evolve, and the key to remaining powerful is not holding on to the past, but identifying the future. By the 1840s and 1850s, he could see that the era of steamboats, while still profitable, was slowly giving way to something far more revolutionary: railroads. America was expanding westward. Settlers, workers, traders, and adventurers were pushing deeper into the continent. Travel by road was too slow, too dangerous, and too unpredictable. Steamboats were limited to rivers and coasts, but railroads had no such limitations. They could cross mountains, cut through forests, and connect distant cities with unprecedented speed. Cornelius Vanderbilt understood that whoever controlled the railroads would control the flow of goods, people, and commerce across a rapidly growing nation. He knew what he needed to do, even if it meant abandoning the empire he had built for decades. And so he began divesting his interests in the steamboat industry. This act shocked his rivals, confused his allies, and baffled many observers. Why leave a business he dominated so completely? Why move into something unstable, unpredictable, and chaotic? The answer was simple. Cornelius did not chase comfort. He chased opportunity. He chased the future. The railroad industry was, at that time, a disorganized patchwork of small lines, each with its own rules, its own equipment, its own management, and often its own problems. Corruption was rampant. Safety was inconsistent. Schedules were unreliable, and most lines were run by men who lacked the discipline and vision needed to shape the industry into something powerful. But where other men saw chaos, Cornelius Vanderbilt saw the same thing he had seen at the start of his steamboat career potential. He began with small investments, learning the system from the inside. Then he acquired controlling stakes in major lines, including the New York and Harlem Railroad. His takeover of the Harlem line was a dramatic event in financial history. When he tried to acquire shares, financiers attempted to stop him by watering stock, printing more shares to dilute his power. But Cornelius responded with a strategy so unyielding and so precise that it forced the manipulators to surrender. He not only gained control of the line, but punished those who tried to outmaneuver him by driving them into financial ruin. From Harlem, he moved on to the Hudson River Railroad, and then the crown jewel, the New York Central. Once he controlled these systems, he unified them, something that no one before him had been bold enough to attempt. He standardized routes, track gauges, schedules, and operations. He improved safety, cut inefficiencies, reduced corruption, and dramatically increased profitability. Under his leadership, railroads transformed from a chaotic patchwork into a powerful, coordinated transportation network that shaped the economy of the northeastern United States. This consolidation was one of the most significant economic missions of the 19th century. It turned New York into a central hub of American commerce. It accelerated industrial growth. It pushed businesses to expand across states. It allowed goods to move quickly, cheaply, and reliably. It connected people in a way the country had never experienced. And it made Cornelius Vanderbilt richer than ever. By the late 1860s and early 1870s, Cornelius Vanderbilt had become one of the wealthiest individuals on earth. His fortune was so vast that modern economists estimate it to be the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars today. This wealth was not inherited, it was not gifted, it was built, brick by brick, decision by decision, risk by risk. It was the result of vision, strategy, and a refusal to accept mediocrity. Yet despite the unimaginable scale of his success, Cornelius remained, at his core, the same man he had always been, practical, determined, and uninterested in the trappings of luxury. While his later descendants would build some of the most extravagant mansions America has ever seen, Cornelius himself lived relatively modestly for a man of his wealth. He preferred function over flair, efficiency over extravagance. He believed that money was a tool for building and shaping the world, not for showcasing personal vanity. In that mindset lay both the strength and the future vulnerability of the Vanderbilt family. Cornelius's practicality built the empire, but his descendants' extravagance would eventually erode it. Still, it is impossible to overstate what Cornelius Vanderbilt accomplished in his lifetime. He shaped industries. He changed how Americans traveled. He influenced the growth of cities and markets. He created jobs, opportunities, and connections that transformed the nation. He was not a man of theories or philosophies. He was a man of motion, action, and results. He believed in power, discipline, and logic, and he understood that the future belonged to those willing to seize it before others even realized it existed. His transition from steamboats to railroads was not simply a business shift, it was a visionary leap. Many wealthy steamboat operators remained in the industry until it collapsed. Cornelius did not make that mistake. He sensed the decline before it was visible to others and moved swiftly to the next frontier. Throughout his life, he repeated this pattern: anticipate change, embrace change, and dominate change. It is within this relentless forward momentum that Cornelius Vanderbilt's greatness truly lies. He was not just a man who built wealth. He was a man who reshaped entire sectors of the economy. He was a force of nature, unyielding, unstoppable, and profoundly influential. Yet as powerful as Cornelius was, he could not control what came after him. Empires built by one extraordinary man often crumble under the stewardship of those who never lived his struggle. And the Vanderbilt Empire, despite its massive scale, would eventually follow that ancient pattern. But before that fall came the golden years, the years when the Vanderbilts lived as American royalty, when their name was synonymous with luxury, when their homes looked like palaces, when their parties rivaled those of European nobility, when their wealth seemed infinite. The seeds of decline were already being planted. But in this moment, in the era shaped by Cornelius Vanderbilt's rise, there was only triumph, power, and an empire unmatched in the history of America. After the death of Cornelius Vanderbilt in 1877, the empire he built stood like a colossal monument, strong, proud, and overflowing with wealth so immense that it felt almost invincible. His fortune, built through ferocious discipline and unmatched business instinct, passed into the hands of his descendants, who now inherited a responsibility far greater than they understood. They received not only money, not only railroads, not only influence. They received the weight of a legacy crafted by a man whose vision was larger than life. Yet, as often happens in the stories of great dynasties, the strength of the founder was not always mirrored in the generations that followed. For many of Cornelius's heirs, wealth was not something to grow or protect. It was something to enjoy, to display, to celebrate. The Gilded Age was beginning, an era defined by opulence, extravagance, and the rise of America's new aristocracy. The Vanderbilts stepped into this era not as students of humility or discipline, but as royalty stepping into coronation halls. They were now among the richest families in the world, and they embraced that identity with a vigor that dazzled the public and shocked even their wealthy peers. If Cornelius had been the embodiment of ambition and discipline, his descendants became the embodiment of Gilded Age privilege. To understand the magnitude of their wealth, one must imagine fortunes so vast that they seemed limitless. The Vanderbilt name alone could open doors to any social circle. They were invited to events, honored at gatherings, and admired for the sheer scale of their riches. But admiration was not enough for the Vanderbilt heirs. They wanted presence, visible, undeniable presence, and that presence was expressed most clearly in the enormous estates they built. Their homes were not simply houses. They were palaces. Palaces meant not for practical living, but for symbolizing status, power, and the sheer grandeur of the Vanderbilt name. These estates were architectural marvels that rivaled the great mansions of Europe. They were constructed with materials imported from the farthest corners of the world, shaped by the hands of artisans, sculptors, and craftsmen whose work would become part of American architectural history. Take, for instance, the breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, perhaps the most iconic Vanderbilt mansion, commissioned by Cornelius's grandson, Cornelius Vanderbilt Roman II. The breakers was a summer home, but calling it a home does not come close to describing its magnitude. It was a palace with 70 rooms, soaring ceilings, marble imported from Italy, and interiors drenched in gold leaf. Everywhere one turned, the mansion announced wealth. The dining room alone contained priceless European decor and lighting fixtures so elaborate they resembled artifacts from royal museums. It was not simply a residence, it was a declaration. But the breakers was only one piece of the Vanderbilt architectural empire. William Kissam Vanderbilt, another grandson of the Commodore, built Marble House, also in Newport, an estate inspired by the Petit Trianon of Versailles. It contained over 500,000 cubic feet of marble and was essentially a temple dedicated to extravagance. Alva Vanderbilt, William's wife, insisted on the highest quality materials imported from Europe, shaped by master craftsmen, and assembled by hundreds of workers. Marble House cost more money than most Americans could imagine at the time, and yet, for the Vanderbilts, it was just one among many palatial estates. In New York City, the family constructed elaborate residences on Fifth Avenue, creating what became known as Vanderbilt Row, a series of massive mansions that stood as a testament to the family's unparalleled wealth. The most famous among them was the triple mansion built by William Henry Vanderbilt, the son of Cornelius. This mansion, located between 51st and 52nd Streets, was an architectural wonder, a grand brownstone palace filled with rare art, fine furnishings, and details inspired by European nobility. Each generation of Vanderbilts seemed intent on surpassing the previous one in displays of wealth. They competed not in business, but in luxury. Social status became a battlefield, and their weapon was extravagance. Their lavish spending was not viewed as indulgence, but as necessity, as a means of maintaining the family name at the top of the social hierarchy. To appreciate how unusual this lifestyle was, one must remember that America at this time was experiencing dramatic transformation. Industrialization was creating a class of ultra-wealthy individuals, but the gap between the rich and the poor was extreme. Millions of Americans worked long hours in dangerous conditions for meager wages, barely surviving. Yet within this environment, the Vanderbilts lived lives so luxurious that they seemed to belong to another world entirely. Their homes were filled with servants, hundreds of them. Their wardrobes contained garments tailored in Paris by the world's finest designers. Their dinners featured imported delicacies, rare wines, and silver, ware so expensive that it could feed a working family for years. Yet the most striking symbol of their extravagance was the famous Vanderbilt Ball of 1883. Hosted by Alva Vanderbilt in her Fifth Avenue mansion, the ball was a social event of unprecedented scale. It was attended by over 1,000 guests, all of whom were required to dress in elaborate costumes inspired by various historical eras. The ballroom was illuminated by countless candles and electric lights, still a novelty at the time. The decorations were lavish, the music intoxicating, and the atmosphere dripping with opulence. Newspapers covered the event in astonishment. For weeks afterward, America talked about the Vanderbilt ball. It became a symbol of the Gilded Age excess, beauty, and extravagance taken to the extreme. But beneath the shimmering surface of this grandeur was a quiet truth. The Vanderbilts had shifted entirely away from the foundational values of their patriarch. Cornelius Vanderbilt had built his empire with discipline, strategy, and practicality. Luxury had never been his goal, but his descendants embraced luxury as their identity. Their wealth gave them access to every possible pleasure, and they embraced it. They lived as though their fortune could never diminish. It wasn't simply the money they spent, it was the lifestyle they created, a lifestyle that required endless income to maintain. Their homes required dozens, sometimes hundreds, of staff members. Their gardens, stables, and private carriages cost vast sums to maintain. They traveled constantly, spent lavishly, entertained extravagantly, and cultivated a social presence that demanded constant investment. The Gilded Age turned wealth into performance, and the Vanderbilts performed as though they were born to rule. Yet even as their mansions glittered and their parties dazzled, subtle cracks began to form within the empire. The unity that had existed under Cornelius began to fade. The family grew in size, spreading across branches. Cousins, siblings, and distant relatives now lived in separate estates, with separate interests and separate priorities. Communication weakened, unity softened, and without unity, the fortune felt less like a single empire and more like a sprawling collection of individually managed inheritances. Moreover, the core source of their wealth, railroads, was facing growing pressure. Competition intensified. The government increased regulations. New transportation technologies, new markets, and new industrial leaders began to rise. And the Vanderbilts, distracted by social prestige and personal luxury, were not paying attention to the shifting tides of the economy. They were spending money faster than they were earning it, and while their wealth was vast, it was not infinite. In the midst of their glittering social lives, many family members had never developed the business acumen of their patriarch. They had not been trained in management, strategy, or financial discipline. They inherited wealth but not wisdom. This is not to say they lacked intelligence. Far from it. Many Vanderbilt descendants were well-educated, cultured, and capable, but capability without discipline is like a ship without a captain. It drifts, it wanders, and eventually it hits the rocks. As the new century approached, the Gilded Age was beginning to fade. Times were changing. The nation was evolving, embracing innovation and efficiency. The cultural obsession with extreme luxury was cooling. The Vanderbilts, however, continued to build, spend, and showcase their wealth, as though the era would last forever. They built new estates, expanded old ones, hosted extravagant social events, and maintained lifestyles that consumed enormous financial resources. Their wealth was still strong, but the trajectory was shifting. Even their architectural wonders, so beautiful and breathtaking, became burdensome. Their upkeep demanded enormous sums. The number of servants required to maintain each mansion was staggering. Every aspect of their lives demanded money, and the money was slowly but steadily flowing outward rather than inward. But in the moment, in the height of their splendor, the Vanderbilts did not see decline. They saw only prestige. Their homes were filled with art, music, laughter, and celebration. Their parties were legendary, their social influence towering. They lived like royalty, and the public was mesmerized by them. Newspaper reporters documented their every move. Photographs of their estates circulated across the nation. The Vanderbilts had become symbols of American wealth, symbols of the extraordinary, symbols of possibility. Yet the same splendor that dazzled the world would soon begin to crumble under its own weight. For in the story of every great empire, there is a moment when the glow of triumph hides the shadow of decline. A moment when the celebration masks the warnings, and while the Vanderbilts danced under their golden chandeliers and walked across their marble floors, the seeds of their eventual fall were being quietly planted. Still in part 3 of their story, in this age of extreme opulence, the Vanderbilt family stood at the height of their power. Their name carried a weight that seemed immovable. Their estates shone with unmatched brilliance. Their parties rivaled those of European aristocracy, and their wealth appeared so vast, so magnificent, that the idea of losing it was almost unimaginable. But time has a way of revealing truths. And soon, the world around the Vanderbilts would change in ways that even their immense fortune could not prevent. As the Vanderbilts stepped deeper into the new century, the world they believed would last forever was silently shifting beneath their feet. For decades, it had seemed as though the family existed in a bubble, protected by privilege, wealth, and a name so powerful that even hearing it could inspire awe. But time has a way of challenging every empire, and even the greatest fortunes cannot resist the slow, steady force of change. The Vanderbilt family, so accustomed to the glittering glow of the Gilded Age, was now entering a period where their extravagant lifestyle no longer aligned with the realities of a rapidly evolving America. The closing years of the 19th century had been the height of their dominance. Their mansions rose like monuments to excess, their wealth poured into grand balls, couture gowns, and jewels imported from Europe. Yet beneath that shimmering world of luxury, cracks were beginning to form, small at first, but unmistakably present. They were the kind of cracks that are usually ignored by those too comfortable to imagine hardship, the kind that widen slowly, invisibly, until suddenly the structure collapses. For the Vanderbilts, these cracks were not in stone or marble, but in something far more fragile, the stability of their fortune. The first shift was cultural. America was no longer the same country Cornelius Vanderbilt had conquered. The era of tycoons who built their empires through brute force, daring risk, and monopolistic control was fading. The government, pressured by the public, had started passing new laws to regulate the massive companies and railroads that had once operated with near-total freedom. These regulations, while aimed at fairness, had a ripple effect. They limited profits, slowed expansion, and placed boundaries on the very industries that had made the Vanderbilts wealthy. Though the family had once controlled transportation with an iron grip, that grip was now loosening. And while the financial landscape was changing, so too were societal attitudes. The Vanderbilts belonged to a generation that equated wealth with responsibility to display it. They believed in showcasing power through architecture, through social events, and through the sheer magnitude of their spending. In their circles, moderation was not admired, grandeur was. A Vanderbilt mansion had to be bigger, brighter, and more elaborate than anything else around it. A Vanderbilt ball had to outshine every competitor's attempts at spectacle. The family had built a reputation based not on the work that created their wealth, but on the extravagant way they displayed it. But as the country moved into the 20th century, public perception began to shift. The extravagant lifestyles of the elite, once tolerated and even celebrated, started to appear distasteful to the average American. New generations, shaped by urbanization, immigration, and labor movements, looked with less admiration toward families who spent millions on gowns while workers struggled to earn a few dollars a week. The Vanderbilts, absorbed in their own insulated world, either failed to notice this shift or chose to ignore it. They continued their parallel universe of glittering galas, European tours, and unrestrained spending, unaware that their world was losing its audience. The second major change came from within the family itself. When Cornelius Vanderbilt was alive, the family had direction, unity, and a single driving force: his relentless ambition. He was the kind of patriarch whose will shaped everything around him. His children and grandchildren, though wealthy, always operated under his shadow. Even after his death, his immediate sons stepped into leadership roles with a sense of duty to the empire he created. But as generations passed, that sense of duty and focus grew weaker. By the time the early 1900s arrived, the Vanderbilt family tree had grown enormously. Dozens of cousins, siblings, nieces, nephews, and distant relations all carried the famous name, and nearly all had some claim to the wealth. However, not all of them had the skills or interest to maintain the fortune. Many enjoyed the privileges of their birth, but possessed little understanding of how that wealth had been earned or what it required to be preserved. A fortune can withstand many pressures, but it cannot withstand endless division. With every new marriage, every inheritance, every branch of the family expanding outward, the Vanderbilt wealth was being sliced into smaller and smaller portions. What had once been a powerful, centralized fortune became fragmented and diluted. This family fragmentation had consequences beyond simply financial ones. It also weakened their collective power. When the Commodore ran the empire, and later when his sons took the helm, decisions were unified. The family operated like a business. They invested, they expanded, they strategized. But by the fourth and fifth generations, the Vanderbilt family gatherings looked less like meetings of empire builders and more like gatherings of socialites with differing opinions, priorities, and lifestyles. Some wanted to preserve the remaining wealth. Others wanted to spend freely, believing that the family name itself was an inexhaustible source of privilege. Without unity, without leadership, and without a shared vision, the family had no way to act as one force. Instead, they drifted apart, each living in their own luxurious sphere. A third factor in the decline was the rise of new financial titans. During the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts had been among the dominant names. But as the 20th century began, new families emerged on the scene, families whose wealth came not from inheritance, but from innovation, reinvestment, and aggressive business expansion. Andrew Carnegie built a steel empire that shaped the modern world. John D. Rockefeller became the undisputed king of oil, his fortune dwarfing nearly all others. J. P. Morgan redefined American finance. These were men who did not inherit their wealth. They built it, nurtured it, and reinvested it strategically. Compared to these new industrial giants, many of the Vanderbilts appeared complacent. They lived in the glow of past achievements rather than creating new ones. While the Rockefellers and Morgans poured their fortunes into new ventures, philanthropic models, and diversified investments, many Vanderbilts were still focused on social prestige, status, and maintaining appearances. In the business arena, their influence waned. In the social arena, they were no longer the only stars. Even within the family's own economic foundation, the railroads, competition intensified. New companies emerged with smarter strategies and more efficient systems. Technological advancements began changing how people and goods traveled. Automobiles and airplanes, still in their infancy, hinted at a future where railroads would no longer reign supreme. For a family whose identity was tied to transportation, this shift posed a threat far greater than any ball or banquet could distract from. Meanwhile, the Great Depression loomed on the horizon. It had not yet arrived, but the economic instability preceding it sent warning tremors throughout the country. Investment losses, decreasing profits, and rising operational costs all played their part. For families who lived well below their means, these tremors were manageable. For families like the Vanderbilts, who lived extravagantly regardless of economic climate, these tremors weakened their already fragile financial foundation. Another issue was that the Vanderbilts never developed a strong tradition of financial oversight. Many wealthy families rely on advisors, trustees, and accountants to preserve and manage their fortunes. But the Vanderbilts, confident in their wealth, often placed their assets in the hands of individuals who lacked the foresight or discipline to protect them. Some decisions were simply unwise. Some investments yielded no returns. Some ventures were poorly timed. The consequence was always the same. The fortune shrank, slowly but steadily. While these external and internal forces shaped the decline, an equally powerful influence came from the changing nature of wealth itself. In the Gilded Age, wealth was physical: railroads, ships, factories, land. But in the 20th century, wealth became more abstract: stocks, bonds, diversified portfolios, international markets. Those who adapted to this shift thrived. Those who did not, those who clung to old systems and outdated industries, suffered. Many of the Vanderbilts found themselves in the latter category. At the same time, the income tax system introduced in the early 1900s chipped away at large fortunes. What might have been passed down from one generation to the next was now substantially reduced. Estate taxes, property taxes, and increasing operational costs for maintaining massive estates all carved out significant portions of Vanderbilt wealth. A mansion that once required hundreds of staff members suddenly became a financial burden. The family would either sell it or struggle to maintain it, both options symbolizing the fading power of their empire. The combined effect of all these pressures, cultural, economic, political, and familial, was devastating, yet the Vanderbilts remained largely unaware of the scale of their problem. When one grows up surrounded by abundance, with every need met and every desire fulfilled, it becomes difficult to imagine a world where such abundance could vanish. They believed the wealth was too large to ever disappear. They believed their name alone guaranteed stability. They believed their lifestyle was eternal. But wealth is not eternal. It is not invincible. It requires stewardship, discipline, and innovation, qualities that had been abundant in Cornelius Vanderbilt, but were increasingly absent in the generations that followed. By the time the early 20th century reached full speed, the warning signs were no longer subtle. Mansions that once brimmed with activity now required more money to maintain than they generated. Some branches of the family began quietly selling off assets. Others denied the reality of their situation, continuing to build, buy, and entertain as though nothing had changed. Their decline was not sudden. It was slow, almost invisible. It crept into their lives quietly, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. And so, as America marched boldly into a new era, industrial, modern, and financially complex, the Vanderbilts drifted further away from the sources of their former power. The age of opulence that had defined them was no longer the age they lived in. Their world had changed, they had not, and the consequences of that misalignment would soon become impossible to ignore. The quiet unraveling of the Vanderbilt fortune, once slow and almost imperceptible, began to accelerate as the 20th century gathered momentum. For decades, the family had drifted through life cushioned by the illusion of permanence. They lived in a world built by the unimaginable strength, ambition, and vision of their forefathers. But that world could not shield them forever. The subtle shifts that had begun in the previous generation, overspending, division, complacency, were gradually turning into undeniable realities. What had once been gentle warning signs had become blunt truth. The grand empire that Cornelius Vanderbilt had forged with steamboats and railroads was beginning to fracture, and the decline that followed was as dramatic as the rise that preceded it. The first waves of trouble surfaced in the early decades of the century. Their massive estates, symbols of magnificence during the Gilded Age, were becoming liabilities. The cost of maintaining these palatial homes was astronomical. Each mansion required dozens, sometimes hundreds of servants, gardeners, cooks, footmen, maids, groundskeepers, drivers, carpenters, butlers, and more. They needed constant repairs, imported materials, lavish furnishings, and endless upkeep. The bills piled higher than anyone outside their world could imagine. During the height of their wealth, such costs meant very little. Money seemed abundant, and the Vanderbilts believed it always would be. But times had changed. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren who inherited these estates now faced a new reality, one where fortune did not replenish itself as easily as it once had. The Biltmore estate in North Carolina, built by George Washington Vanderbilt Roman II, stands as a testament to this struggle. It was one of the most stunning pieces of architecture in the country, an American castle with sweeping gardens and a level of grandeur unmatched by anything else. But behind the beauty was an undeniable truth. The estate hemorrhaged money. It was a masterpiece, but also a magnificent financial burden. To keep it running required a fortune unto itself. George, unlike many of his cousins, understood the danger this posed. He attempted to manage the estate responsibly, cutting costs where he could, but even then the expenses were overwhelming, and that was only one estate. Across the country, from Newport to New York, from Long Island to Asheville, Vanderbilt mansions stood towering over the land, each demanding endless resources to stay alive. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff, Rough Point, and dozens of other homes were symbols of an era that no longer matched the world around them. They had been built for a purpose: to display wealth, to impress society, to reinforce a family's dominance. But in a new century marked by economic uncertainty, greater taxation, and shifting social values, they were relics of a time that was fading away. As financial burdens increased, another significant challenge pressed in: the diversification of family interests. In previous generations, the Vanderbilts operated like a unified machine, their efforts and ambitions aligned. But with each passing generation, the family tree expanded dramatically. Hundreds of descendants across dozens of branches meant that wealth was spread thinly. Inheritance, once concentrated in the hands of a few capable leaders, was now divided among many. Each descendant inherited far less, yet many maintained the same extravagant lifestyle they had grown accustomed to. In the absence of a strong guiding figure, a role once occupied by Cornelius and, to a lesser extent, by his sons, the family lacked direction. Some wished to sustain the fortune through investment, others wanted to spend it freely, and still others drifted between the two, uncertain of their purpose. A divided vision inevitably led to a divided fortune. Compounding this, the railroad industry, the core of the Vanderbilt empire, began to struggle. The early signs of this had been visible before, but now they grew undeniable. Railroads faced fierce competition from automobiles, highways, trucking companies, and eventually airlines. The transportation landscape was transforming. The new generation of Americans valued speed, freedom, and personal travel, qualities that automobiles embodied far more than trains. Though trains remained essential for freight, passenger rail, once a major source of Vanderbilt prestige and income, was steadily declining. The grand terminals and luxury cars that once symbolized their power now felt outdated. The business model that had made the Vanderbilts rich was losing relevance. Government regulations added further pressure. New laws restricted monopolistic practices, limited profit margins, imposed safety requirements, and challenged the vertically integrated systems that had made railroad tycoons powerful. The Interstate Commerce Commission had significantly more control than it did in Cornelius Vanderbilt's time. The railroads could no longer operate in the aggressive, unrestricted manner that had allowed rapid expansion and soaring profits. This shift, combined with rising taxes, chipped away at what remained of the family income. Inside the family itself, a subtle transformation was occurring. The new generation was raised in an environment of abundance, not enterprise. Unlike Cornelius, who knew poverty intimately and built his wealth with relentless determination, many of his descendants never experienced struggle. Their lives were steeped in luxury from birth. They grew up attending elite schools, surrounded by servants, traveling to Europe, and living in homes filled with art and riches. The drive that shaped the founding patriarch had not been passed down. Wealth, for them, was not a reward for work. It was a given. And when wealth becomes an expectation rather than an achievement, the skills required to regenerate it often fade. Many of the younger Vanderbilts pursued lives centered around leisure social gatherings, travel, hobbies, and entertainment. They were admired by society, but they contributed little to the preservation of their wealth. Those who did attempt to build careers often struggled, lacking the fire and business instincts that had defined their ancestors. Still, they lived with the belief that fortune would always support them. It was a comforting illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. The arrival of World War I accelerated the changes already underway. The global economy was shaken, markets shifted, and families like the Vanderbilts, whose wealth was tied to industries affected by wartime conditions, faced new pressures. Some estates were offered to the government for wartime efforts, not out of generosity alone, but because they had become too expensive to maintain. Yet despite these stresses, the Vanderbilts continued hosting grand events and maintaining enormous social obligations. Their lifestyle demanded a constant output of money while their income continued to shrink. But nothing tested the family fortune more severely than the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in 1929, it sent shockwaves through every level of society. The wealthy suffered alongside everyone else. Investments crumbled, businesses closed, and fortunes evaporated overnight. For families with diverse, adaptive investments, such as the Rockefellers who had created strong foundations and philanthropic structures, the Depression was painful but survivable. But for families like the Vanderbilts, who had long relied on inherited wealth and declining industries, the crash was devastating. Their lavish estates and extravagant lifestyles suddenly became unsustainable. The cost of running a mansion during the Depression was almost impossible to justify. The servants they once employed in the hundreds became a rarity. The gardens that once required armies of workers became overgrown. The ballrooms that once hosted thousands fell silent. In these once glorious spaces, the decline of an empire was palpable, not dramatic, but slow and sorrowful. There were no grand announcements, no public acknowledgments of defeat. Just empty corridors, shuttered windows, and fading echoes of a world that had vanished. One by one, the massive estates were sold off. Some were purchased by wealthy industrialists who still maintained fortunes. Others were acquired by governments or institutions. Many were simply demolished. Perfectly good mansions, filled with marble, gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and priceless art, were torn down because their owners could no longer afford to keep them standing. Marble House, one of the most extravagant creations of the Vanderbilts, nearly faced demolition. The breakers only survived because its owners were among the few who could still sustain it, and even then, it eventually transitioned into a preservation society's care. For many descendants, selling these homes was not just a financial decision. It was an emotional one. These mansions had been central to the family identity. They were symbols of pride, glamour, and power. Watching them slip away was like watching their heritage dissolve. Yet the burden was too great, and sentiment could not outweigh reality. By the 1940s and 1950s, the Vanderbilt name still held echoes of grandeur, but the fortune behind it had evaporated. Some family members adapted well. They pursued careers, built modest lives, and accepted the new reality. Others continued chasing a lifestyle no longer supported by their means. A few married into wealth to sustain the illusion, but most simply adjusted to life without the empire that had once defined them. The decline reached a poignant moment in 1973. A family reunion was organized, one that brought together hundreds of living descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Once, the idea of such a gathering would have seemed like a celebration of shared power and influence. But the revelation that emerged that day was stunning, almost surreal. Not one of them was a millionaire. Not a single living descendant of the man who had once been the richest person in America retained even a fraction of his monumental fortune. What had taken one determined man a lifetime to build had dissipated entirely in just 3 generations. It was not one catastrophic event that caused the downfall. There was no single decision, no singular moment of destruction. Instead, it was a gradual erosion, a combination of overconfidence, lack of financial planning, changing industries, increasing taxes, family fragmentation, and an inability to adapt to the world after the Gilded Age. The decline of the Vanderbilt Empire was almost poetic in its tragedy. A dynasty that once embodied American wealth had become a symbol of how fragile even the greatest fortunes can be. Their story is not merely about the loss of money, it is about the consequences of losing purpose, unity, and foresight. It is about the peril of assuming that wealth is eternal. It is about the difference between earning a fortune and simply inheriting one. The Vanderbilts lived in magnificence, but they also lived in a mirage that eventually dissolved. Yet even in their decline, their legacy remains undeniable. Their contributions to American infrastructure, architecture, and culture continue to shape the nation. Their mansions, preserved as museums, invite millions of visitors each year to marvel at the splendor of a bygone age. Their influence, though no longer financial, is historical, and history remembers them not only for their rise, but also for their fall. It is in this quiet unraveling, in the slow fading of their wealth, that the most human part of their story emerges, the understanding that empires are not sustained by grandeur alone, but by discipline, unity, and the ability to evolve. The Vanderbilts, for all their brilliance and beauty, ultimately became a reflection of what happens when a family drifts away from the very foundations that made it extraordinary. In the years after the Vanderbilt fortune dissolved into memory, what remained of the family gradually settled into quieter lives. The world they once commanded with grandeur and extravagance had transformed far beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. It is in this quiet aftermath, not in the thunder of their rise or the drama of their fall, that the true meaning of their legacy comes into view. For the Vanderbilts, the conclusion of their story is not one of disappearance, but of transformation, from wealth into wisdom, from empire into history, from spectacle into reflection. The once mighty family estates, which had seemed eternal in their imposing beauty, were slowly repurposed, preserved, or surrendered. Some became museums, open to the public, allowing ordinary people to walk through the same grand halls that once hosted royalty, industrialists, and the elite of the Gilded Age. Visitors peered up at ceilings painted with mythological scenes, chandeliers that glowed with imported crystal, staircases carved from marble shipped across oceans. These homes, once private palaces, became monuments, silent storytellers of a bygone era. Each room whispered the same truth, that wealth is temporary, but the impressions it leaves behind can endure. One of the most striking examples of this is the Biltmore estate. No longer a private home, it became a place where history breathes openly. Its vast halls, once filled with the laughter of wealthy guests and the footsteps of dozens of servants, transformed into exhibits for the world to see, the gardens that once required an entire staff of horticulturists now flourish as symbols of preservation. It stands as the largest privately owned house in America, not because the fortune behind it survived, but because later generations found value in protecting its memory. In its preservation lies a subtle victory. Even though the Vanderbilt wealth faded, the beauty they created still inspires awe. The breakers in Newport became another symbol of what remained. Once the crown jewel of the Vanderbilt summer social season, it now welcomes thousands of visitors each year. The tapestries, marble floors, and ornate sculptures are preserved not as remnants of a still, living dynasty, but as relics of a world that no longer exists. The Preservation Society of Newport County stepped in to protect the home when the family could no longer maintain it, ensuring that the mansion would outlive the fortune that built it. It transformed from a private show of wealth into a public lesson on the impermanence of excess. These estates, and the stories engraved within their walls, reveal an interesting truth. While the money itself disappeared, the impact of the Vanderbilt architectural legacy remained strong. Their homes became the physical embodiment of an era historians still study today, the Gilded Age, a time when the gap between wealth and poverty stretched wide, and when families like the Vanderbilts defined what it meant to be elite. Those grand structures now serve as open pages in the book of American history. Through them, visitors can understand not only how the wealthy lived, but also how they thought, dreamed, and defined themselves. But the legacy of the Vanderbilts is not contained solely in architecture. It is also found in the railroads, the arteries of a nation, that helped shape America's industrial identity. Cornelius Vanderbilt, through relentless drive and powerful ambition, played a major role in unifying the country's transportation networks. The lines he built, the systems he improved, and the competition he inspired set the stage for a more connected United States. Even after the Vanderbilt empire collapsed, the railroads they influenced continued to serve millions of people. They connected cities, delivered goods, and supported the growth of countless industries. The fortune that was lost did not erase the lasting impact of the work that created it. While later generations may not have maintained the wealth, the foundation Cornelius laid contributed to the expansion of the American economy. His influence rippled through time, touching lives far removed from his own. It is almost poetic that the man who built an empire through movement and speed left behind a legacy that still moves people, long after his family fortune slowed to a halt. Yet there is another, more subtle part of the Vanderbilt legacy, the lesson they leave behind. Their story is a reminder of the fragility of wealth, the importance of direction, and the dangers of assuming that prosperity will continue without effort. Many families rise and fall throughout history, but few do so in such a dramatic, public, and thoroughly documented way as the Vanderbilts. Their rise was a spectacular triumph of hard work and innovation. Their fall was a quiet but powerful demonstration of how easily the fruits of such work can disappear when not protected with discipline and foresight. The strength of the first generation, the ambition of Cornelius, stands in stark contrast to the extravagance and carefree lifestyles of later descendants. This contrast has sparked discussions among historians, economists, and sociologists for decades. How does a fortune so vast vanish so quickly? The answer lies not in a single cause, but in a constellation of choices, some made deliberately, others made passively. Over time, those choices accumulated until even a monumental fortune could not withstand them. But despite the losses, not all Vanderbilt descendants faded into obscurity. Some built meaningful careers in their own right. Gloria Vanderbilt, for example, became famous not for inherited wealth, but for her creativity, style, and resilience. Her fashion line, the iconic denim jeans bearing her name, became a cultural phenomenon. Her life, marked by tragedy, reinvention, and determination, stood as a testament to the idea that legacy is not confined to wealth alone. She showed the world that even when a fortune is gone, identity, creativity, and reinvention remain powerful. Her son, Anderson Cooper, became a respected journalist and public figure, known for his thoughtful reporting and integrity. He often spoke openly about his family's history, acknowledging both the glamour and the loss with a sense of perspective that previous generations did not possess. Through him, the Vanderbilt name found new relevance, not in the echo of wealth, but in the presence of purpose and authenticity. He became living proof that a name once tied to fortune can survive and thrive in an entirely different world. This shift, from wealth to meaning, from opulence to reflection, is perhaps the most profound chapter of the Vanderbilt story. Their legacy transformed from one of material grandeur to one of historical significance and personal reinvention. They showed that identity is not fixed in fortune. It can evolve, adapt, and rediscover itself. The decline of their empire also leaves behind a deeper message about the nature of time. Every era has its giants, its dominant families, its leading industries, its cultural icons, but time moves forward, indifferent to the grandeur of any age. The Gilded Age passed into memory. The railroad era gave way to automobiles, airplanes, and digital networks. The families who once shaped the nation found that the nation continued to evolve without them. This is not a tragedy, but a truth, a reminder that nothing stays the same forever. Those who adapt move forward. Those who do not remain as stories, preserved in books, museums, and whispered recollections. The Vanderbilts became a story, a grand, dramatic, unforgettable story. Their rise from poverty to the summit of American wealth is as legendary as their decline. Their name, though no longer attached to immense fortunes, carries weight through its historical depth. People remember the Commodore not only for what he built, but for what he represented: ambition without limits, innovation without fear, and determination without pause. And so, the Vanderbilt legacy survives in a different form, not as living wealth, but as living history. Their story is studied in classrooms, told in documentaries, discussed in books, and explored in museums. Visitors walk the halls of their former homes, imagining the lives lived within those walls. Students analyze their empire to understand the rise and fall of fortunes. Economists examine their decline to illustrate the dangers of unchecked spending and unprepared.